Hello, everybody, and even if you don't have a body, I'm Layman Pascal, out front so you don't have to be, on behalf of myself and Bruce Alderman and the seething, inchoate masses of the extended liminal web and the nascent meta tribe and the whole damn scene. This is the integral stage, and today we're going to have a totally chill, super mutual, relaxed, authentic chat with a woman who answers that age-old question, what's the plural of an Adnam? It's Sally Adnams Jones, and she's deeply interested in human creativity as a fractal extension of the basic creative evolutionary power of non-dual being and becoming. So let's see if she and I can invent each other in a way that slides back and forth through some interesting territories that leave us wondering luminously which one of us each one of us is. Hi, Sally.
I'm definitely a plural. I will own that right off the bat. I'm an Adnams, and there's a Jones as well.
Excellent. Well, and we were talking about this just before we turned the recording on. Let's start with, why is this an important discourse? Why is the subject matter we're talking about significant, weighty, important? What's its relevance to you?
Yeah, great question, because I find it both playful and deadly serious. I think that with the situation that we're facing as a global community, we are just iterating old ways of being, and we're not coming up with new ways of problem solving. And there's a lot of reasons for that. One of which is that creativity has been marginalized in many ways through the education system, through the marketplace, through something that McGilchrist calls left brain chauvinism, which is a relic of the old patriarchy where logic is valued over imagination, with the masculine over the feminine. So there's a lot of reasons why we need to resurrect and understand creativity, because it's literally a matter of life and death at this point. So there's the big picture, and the little picture is that because of my own life trajectory, being through several traumas, immigration, losses, dark valleys of the soul, I've always returned to creativity as a healing mechanism, spontaneously in the beginning, didn't understand why. And then, because it was so transformative for me, and then when I was working with others, with students, with clients, for others, I really needed to understand the mechanism. So then I pursued a PhD in how creativity transforms us.
That brings up two questions for me. And the one is a little bit more theory oriented, which is, I guess I want to say, so you see the marginalization of creativity as part of a larger set of marginalizations of, let's say, the yin or the feminine or the right brain and the embodied and that whole set of things. And this is part of that marginalization. So that's the theory question. And then the practical question is, we'll have to get into this. What is the mechanism by which creativity is healing? Why should it be the case that creativity heals?
Yeah, so those are two big questions. So let's answer the first one. Yes, the yin has been marginalized. As we know, we don't have to talk about the rise of patriarchy and how it is now disassembling, and how the feminine as an archetype is arising. So we need to understand the yin and the yang, or the Tao of that. And in integral language, it sort of started as this valuing of the masculine started, I think, as we left tribal community and had severe survival issues. So there's a red impulse to creativity and agency that is both healthy and unhealthy. And that's why we look at rock stars and great artists as these very erotic beings. So as blue came online, there was a lot of crushing of that. So we need to resurrect the red impulse, but we'll talk about the physiology as well of creativity. And as we came into orange, the left brain became really dominant as a way of problem solving. It was our first step into world centricism. This beautiful engineering type of left brain became dominant and started figuring out medicine, water wells, bridges, artillery. But because that's based in survival thinking, like how do we survive our disease, our drought, our warfare, that became very dominant. But now that we're entering green and beyond, there's this return to understanding how there's an ecology of thinking, that there's an inclusiveness that we need to consider. So there's a new way of thinking that is emerging. And as we don't have to talk about the pathology of it, let's just look at the healthy versions of this. Green is coming online, and then yellow is really trying to integrate this masculine and feminine. And I personally believe that second tier is about integrating yin and yang. That's my take. There's an integration internally, there's an integration in community, but it's tumultuous because nobody gives up power willingly. And the masculine owns the means of power. So this shift is going to happen economically, in the education system, everywhere, politically, but it's long, it's slow, and it's dangerous. But what is happening is as the brain and the community integrate, creativity will be liberated because voices will emerge, new thinking will be allowed, the feminine will be allowed to come forward and envision. Whereas the masculine tends to problem solve, the feminine, and that's, as McGilchrist talks about in his books, that's the left brain tendency. The right brain tendency is to vision and imagine. And that is no longer split into boys and girls or what is acceptable as a way of being. We can now do both in any body, any gender, and that's what happens with women as they come into orange. They become more yang, and as men actually integrate green, they become more yin. So second tier is about this beautiful potential where we can all liberate our creativity, whatever that looks like.
I'm really curious about the, you touched on it, this need to sort of go back down the stack to the tribal form of these things and the role that that might play in this integration going forward, because it seems like where the civilization has come to is a place where we need to bring up a lot of the features of tribal culture, right? There's a certain empowerment, there's a certain embodiment, there's a certain embedding in the ecological, there's a certain need as we see culture sort of failing to provide us with the enlivenment in the community and the meaningfulness that we need to go back to really early forms of human culture and see what we can take forward from that. In those cultures, there was a lot of clarity around, say, these are the men's mysteries and these are the women's mysteries and these are the different roles for the different types of people. And I think there's a really open question about if we're going to bring some of the tribal back into our civilization, do we bring it back in the form? Where do we bring forward the old tribal and where do we invent a new tribal? And, are there going to be sort of specifically feminine styles and specifically masculine styles, or do we just not know that and we need to put everything on the table now, even though traditionally we might have segregated some of it to make special sacred spaces for men or for women? Do you have a sense of like what we need to bring forward from the tribal, what we need to heal at the tribal, and where we might need to invent some new thing that the tribal only reminds us of?
Beautiful question, because this is moving beyond bodies into psychological potential that we can manifest uniquely in whatever body we're in. So let's look at the impulse of emergence or agency and emergence or community, which Wilbur always said that's what's fundamentally happening is, and underneath the spiral dynamics is the yin-yang flow. One movement is toward more agency, red and orange and yellow, and the other is towards more community, the purple, blue, and green. And so we're always moving from an emergence to emergence if we're integrating properly. And so tribal culture was more about conforming and merging. So that was for safety reasons. Like if you had an outlier or somebody who was a rampant individual, they'd cause a lot of trouble and the tribe would be threatened. And that happens at blue again. So every feminine stage, there's a pressure to merge again. And every masculine stage is an opening up into emergence. You know, the reds, the oranges, the yellows. And at some point that always becomes toxic. And then the pendulum swings back again. It's corrective. It's like there's this balance that's built into the system to correct a homeostasis for us, because health and balance are this one and the same thing. So there's a pendulum, an oscillation. We do that personally as we develop, and communities do that. So the interesting thing now, part two of your question is, how do we resurrect the tribal? There will be that community pressure again at green to start merging and including again. So that will happen naturally because that is the pattern of evolution. But there's an interesting thing. For example, there have been so many people who've tried to identify what transformation is, and they've said it in various ways. One of the beautiful, simple ways was Maslow saying that we evolve through a series of needs. And then we finally come to self-actualization once our basic needs are met, our physiological belonging, community needs. He said the pinnacle was individuation. So he is now being criticized for this because he didn't take it far enough. But there are other indigenous maps. For example, the Blackfoot map of human development says that development only starts with the individual, because then that individual must actualize and serve the community's interests. So we can see here that their value is more about serving the community, and the West was more about individuating the separate human. And so bringing these into balance, the indigenous ideas of the value of the tribe and the value of the human and how they can serve each other. Because Maslow understood you can't individuate until your needs are met. Indigenous culture says, we will meet your needs and you must serve us. So that's sort of the idea of the potlatch too, like we give and then you give back. And so it's the same thing. We need to just expand and include both. And that second tier is always both and. One is not more important than the other. We're interdependent. And that's when the best creativity happens, when the individual is supported and is also developing. So if we look at Wilber's 4 quadrants, let's just take a look at that briefly. In the upper right is the physiology of that, and we can talk about it. There's a definite state that we can activate. And it's a brain state, it's a physiological state, it's biological. Then there's also the upper left, which is the personal skills we need, the introspection, the curiosity, the openness, the risk-taking. There's a way of being that activates creativity. Then there's the community that supports it or not. And we've had millennia of generations of not having creativity supported. It's undervalued, it's minimized, it's shamed as feminine, it's not valued in the marketplace, blah, blah. And then we have the institutions that can support it, like the education system and the monetary system and the therapeutic system. So creativity is a 4-quadrant occurrence.
The thing that leapt out at me there is, we use a word like community, and it's a very expansive notion, but there's also this sense in the lower left quadrant of, families, of couples, all right? And the community is a little bit distance from us. It's the community's out there somewhere around us. But really, the interpersonal, the intersubjective dimension of what seems to enable creativity is what's in the home, in our immediate lives and relationships with each other. Wonder how you think about fostering creativity in the family, in the home, with children or between partners, things like that.
Yeah, it's super important because red emerges in the household. It starts at the age of 2 when the individual starts asserting its I and starts getting oppositional. And it peaks at puberty, really, where the individual's had enough of every bit of authority and is anti-establishment. So how the parent treats the emerging red will determine a lot about the future of that kid. So even simple things like, don't jump in that puddle, you'll get dirty. Don't follow that impulse of curiosity to know what wetness is, because my life will be hard, I have to wash your clothes. So stimulating the child and not repressing their natural curiosity to touch, feel, explore, express, laugh, cry, especially boys, and continue to encourage self-expression. I noticed even with my young men, as much as I did that, as soon as they stepped out into the school system, they learned how to become masculine, which was to dampen down their expressiveness, dampen down their facial expressions, chill, like don't get passionate. That's not masculine. So a lot of it is learned. Creativity is also inherited. We know that. So there's a basic creativity in every human. Totally. And that must be nurtured in the house. But there's also the talent. So the line of intelligence, we also know about lines of intelligence. Some kids have kinesthetic, sensory intelligence, synthesizing intelligence, and a visual intelligence or a verbal intelligence. And those are the signs of an early creativity. And those specifically should be nurtured in the home when we recognize, oh, this kid is showing something that is different, and we need to nurture that.
I like the way you talk about the physical exploring, right? So much of this stuff that becomes abstract and culturally creative later begins in the body. I remember very clearly being able to understand Heidegger at one point by analogy to a process I used to do. When I was a kid, I would climb trees and see how far I could go without having to come to the ground, like how many trees I could go along. And you'd end up doing all sorts of quasi-acrobatic motions. And I was deeply trying to read a Heidegger essay one time, and the sentence had the same shape. I'm like, oh, I've done that. I did that between 2 trees. My body knew what the logic pattern he was talking about was. And then it was opening up to me. And I also thought about, we have a boy here, and he wants to do physical things, but he needs a little bit extra. He needs sort of some official affirmation of it, right? And sometimes the mother and the sisters don't see that clearly, or that when I take on the quasi-paternal role, very often I just have to say yes, right? It'll be a cliff and a river, and he'll go, should I jump? And all he needs for you is to say, yes, jump, and then he'll do the rest. But that physical opening and awakening seems so essential to afford the space that will later be filled in by or reach out into culturally creative forms of self-expression.
Yeah, I'm so glad you introduced this, that it's embodied. And so allowing our young boys to risk take is super important. That's how they find their limits, and they need to find their limits. so we look at this little, the creature of impulse, and the best we can do is just try to focus that uncontrolled energy into something creative rather than destructive. That good parenting is to try to not dampen that impulse, but to help guide it towards constructing rather than deconstructing. So yeah, you can break that thing just to see how it works, but now let's try and reassemble it. Like, how does it work? So constant, and boys are beautifully off the wall. I had two that, you could hardly contain or repress their desire to explore. They want to know how everything works, and they're very manual and physical and need to jump off roofs, and they find their limits eventually by breaking a bone, and mums aren't great at letting that happen. So ideally, we need a masculine partner of any gender, and we need a feminine partner of any gender. So the one that is helping the child soothe the nervous system is usually the feminine partner, like nourishing, holding that child so that they do find those limits and feel safe. There's an embrace. And it's the other partner who says, go for it. I'm here, I'll catch you, but you need to fall. So those are two approaches. One parent can do both, but it's unusual because it's a type. You usually don't even know what you're doing. There's a type. And interestingly, those aspects are within us, in the left and the right brain. And that's the work of the integration. Is the wild boy energy needs to become disciplined and focused. And the quiet girl who's sitting reading, and these are stereotypes, I know, but the education system has always been more supportive of girl energy. They sit and read and they explore, and they're internal. They start creating story, imagining. There's a proclivity, and it can be in a different body, a male or female body. But those are rewarded sometimes in schools. So we know that the Finnish school system, for example, is allowing more recess for that explosion of energy, and it's really paying off. The metrics show that those kids are really doing well. And also they value the quiet introspection of the yin and the yang of being creative. There's two things going on here, the explosion outward and the problem solving in the world, and the imagination and recessive awareness. Some people have said that is, if you define creativity, it's the integration of the external and the internal.
I'm curious how you think about the comprehensiveness or insufficiency of a dualistic model, right? So we have, up till very recently, it takes two genders to reproduce in our species and in most species. Two different types of genetic chromosomal patterning in human beings. It's very convenient for us to describe the world as being an interplay of yin and yang. But then people are going to come along and say, why two? Isn't there a whole bunch of other stuff that falls outside of that? And you could say, well, maybe two is just a convenient way to summarize things for creatures with brains like us. You could say, well, the plurality is really, that's what yin stands for. That's already included. Diversity is on one of these two sides. Or you could say, really two isn't going to be enough. Ultimately, there may need to be a lot more, or another number, or why would it even be a number that makes sense to us? What if it's pi or the square root of -1? Or, why would the universe's patterns fit into our categories neatly? So how do you feel about how useful is yin yang? Is the notion of a complementary dyad versus challenges that suggest maybe we need to think beyond that?
Yeah, this is a beautiful question, Layman. So essentially, I think we are patterns ourselves. We're kind of a condensed energy vibration that manifests into a body. This is my ontology. So there's understanding the energetics of this. And many people have described us, and Taoism does this. I'm what you would call an integral Taoist, is that we are the flow of the divine, and how we learn how to manage this body is critical. And we are designed in a binary, a left and right brain, 2 eyes, 2 feet, 2 hands. And nothing can reproduce without us in human biology, without a sperm and an egg. So there's this basic polarity built into the universe that constitutes duality. And we're so down on duality, but it's beautiful. It's this, the unitative process splits into 2. And there's a tension created between them. The creative tension, whether it's like AC/DC current, there's a positive and negative pole between which the electricity flows. That shows up in every single level of evolution, in the physiosphere, in the biosphere. And I think now we're understanding it shows up in the noosphere as creativity. That's what I'm exploring, what I'm writing about, is creativity itself doesn't emerge. It is the void. It is the field of potential from which content emerges. Creativity is the field from which various objects and contents emerge. So those can keep changing and altering and developing. The contents develop. The field itself is just the field of potential from which burst forth the physiosphere, from which burst forth the biosphere, and then the noosphere. And so we're beginning to understand this archetype at every level of evolution as the current between 2 poles. And that's internal in our brain. It's everywhere. It's a pattern. Actually, interestingly, I'm doing an exhibition right now of this pattern. I'm in love with the delta pattern of emergence, where the one river splits into 2 and then into a delta of diversity. That is the pattern of emergence, of evolution. It's within our lungs, our veins, in the tree silhouette, in the leaves. So I think we are basically patterns observing other patterns and trying to classify and name them. So even the beautiful, beautiful emergent thinking of Wilbur was a synthesization of the diversity that was already there. So he was a great pattern articulator. To really come up with a new iteration is virtually impossible, actually, if you look at creativity studies. There is nothing new under the sun. What happens is 2 things come into relationship and a third is sparked. So there's a new iteration. It happens genetically, it happens mimetically. Wilbur gathered information. There was a dance in his brain, he synthesized, and there was a new emergent. So he's a beautiful example of creativity. He was a map maker, so he was very logical and in his left brain. But we need both. So we need the logic and we need the imagination. And so to simplify this, there's math and there's art. There's a way of reducing everything to a beautiful number that can be measured. It's what we would call convergent thinking. There's only one right answer. Here's the map, here's the answer, here's the bridge, here's the formula for the building. And then there's the divergent thinking, which here's the problem, and there's multiple answers. Which one should we go with? That gets trained out early in school because they only ever measure right and wrong answers. So that's where the left brain became dominant, and it's critical that we start introducing the problem-solving divergent thinking.
I'm very attracted to the model of sort of generative synthesis, integration, creating novelty. I grew up paying a lot of attention to occult traditions that focused on that. And I remember Arthur Kessler, who coined the term "hold on," has a book on the act of creation, where he tracks a kind of fusion of contexts to create novelty, as he tracks it as humor, as poetry, and as science, and shows the same shape occurring as like a bifurcation of two planes of meaning. When they integrate, they generate this new phenomenon. And I think it's really informed a lot of my thinking around how spiritual practice operates, that spiritual practices are meant to bring multiple internal subjective systems into an integration that produces more than the sum of their parts, which we experience as the coming forth of spirit, or as a quality of beingness, or some numinous coherent quality that expresses itself beyond these parts. And that the left and the right modes are two very significant internal parts, right? And the chakras could be parts, and the conscious and the unconscious. There's different ways to think about what those parts are. But what McGilchrist is calling left and right are two very significant internal systems. And if we could get more resonance between them, we'd get more of the, not only the creativity, but the experience of inhabiting ourselves as existentially satisfied beings, as beings in contact with some additional feeling of being present, which is really the only thing that can satisfy us, as far as I can tell, through experimentation. The other thing that popped up from, oh no, go ahead.
I'm going to run with that, because this is what I'm working on at the moment, is the perennial anatomy, or we look at chakras, Wilbur looked at chakras, why you give them different colors. The perennial anatomy of creativity. There is one, and I'm busy writing the book about this right now. So some people have said, like Taoism says, it's the electricity between male and female. India said it's kundalini or shakti arising through consciousness, the dance of consciousness and energy. So many people have said different things, like Maslow said it was a peak experience, creativity. Other people like Gardner said it was multiple intelligences integrating. What I'm exploring is how creativity can be used at the different levels of the chakras, or the stages of development. There's definitely an overlay between chakras and spiral dynamics. So what I'm investigating is that sort of at the base level, we can use creativity to problem solve for survival. We build bridges, we build ditches, it's beautiful. We manifest a very survival-based creativity to stay alive. We can then, at the second level, we can use creativity for beauty and attraction and allurement, and this aesthetic that develops between people and their environment. And we see birds doing that. The bowerbird, who builds this beautiful nest with shiny objects to attract his mate. Humans do that. Beauty and symmetry, and there's all that whole thing. We can use creativity at the level of empowerment as well, like the third chakra, the will, the developing agency, or coming into the yang part of creativity, which is about manifesting and impacting, and making cultural objects that leave the body and go and change culture. There's that. We can use creativity at the heart chakra, which is what I generally write about, is the therapeutic heart healing, the expressive arts that begin to heal our pain and our wounds at the heart level and connect us. We bridge from the internal to the external at the heart level. We can use creativity at that level. We can take it further at the throat level, which is to start voicing, speaking about injustice, making art objects that are activist. Lots of people are doing that right now. We're making art and books and music about injustice. You know, with the beautiful tradition of, say, Black soul music, which is about the healing, the bridging, the injustice. It shows up in all the creative languages, the gestural, the musical, the verbal, the textual. The throat is the way we express that. We can start using creativity at this level of understanding it as a polarity, coming into a meditative state, which is one of my preferred methods, which is to start doing the object that takes you into a different state as you do it. So you begin to descend into theta waves, which are the most creative. You come out of your little anxious, goal-orientated beta wave, drop into alpha, maybe you start dancing, put on some music, and then you settle into this profound, slow presence that is the theta brainwave, where you can start creating from this very grounded, present place, fearlessly. And then some people would drop into delta and do dream work. So there's that we're looking at states, the physiological state of coming into parasympathetic, the relaxed, open curiosity. And then, of course, my favorite, and which I'm trying to articulate, is that seventh chakra. It's the level of identity. Who are you? I am one with evolution. That is my identity. I am a fractal of that. And that is how I live my life, expressing emergence in every given moment. So I don't want to bore everybody, but there are ways we use and express our creativity at the different levels of development.
I have a tendency to treat chakras more like Gardnerian lines than like stages, but I think the metaphor is useful.
It's a metaphor. It's
Both directions. There's an interesting thing about chakras, this notion of the ascending and descending current. And one of the things that brings forward is the possibility of what I call premature ascent, right? Where there's kind of natural movement through in one direction through these systems or centers or functions. And there's a tendency that some people have had historically to reject the body, reject the world, reject sexuality, things like that, and to try to escape up to what they experience as higher chakras. And I thought of that when you were describing the throat and the movement towards socially relevant creativity. Because do you think there's a risk in sort of prematurely moving to the throat? Because one critique artists often have is that when people try to foreground justice or cultural values or the need for social change, that often their art starts to lack integrity, right? That a stand-up comedian who wants to tell you what's important isn't focusing on the thing that the other comedians say makes you actually funny. Right? Is there a danger in going too soon to these seemingly higher forms of creativity and losing the authenticity that would underwrite them?
Totally. So, the thing I just described, you could automatically make the mistake of saying, well, then creatives must be highly developed. Not necessarily. They can be disintegrated just like everybody else. So part of the depth exploration of one's creativity would be not only finding the voice, although until that's opened, you can't really express, but would also be finding your authentic voice, your unique gift, not just an iteration of somebody else prematurely. You can, as you said, you can tell when somebody's iterating or when somebody's creating. And there's a bodily awareness that comes with it that you can detect. As a teacher, you would do that. But the finding of the authentic voice is a very important part of the journey. So finding the skill or doing the 10,000 hours is important, base level. You've got to do the thing over and over. It's really dull and repetitive until you become a master. Then you leap off and individuate into your unique voice. And a part of that is the development of the human from their, what we would call their false self, through to their evolutionary unique self. Gaffney talks about the development of the self. You have to find your true self, which is going inwards, finding that grounded, authentic being, You have to probably do a journey through the false self of just trying to copy other people and iterate. Then you find your unique self, which is your voice, your content. What are you passionate about? Have you learnt the skills at the most basic disciplinary 10,000 hours level to actually execute that passion? That's the yin and the yang. And then once you realize, oh my God, this thing is just coming through me, I can't even stop it anymore. That's the evolutionary unique self, where your creativity is put into service to the whole. And you've surrendered. You don't even control that anymore. But you've done the discipline to get the skill. You've learned who you are. And finally, this identity comes on board where all you are is the flow of evolution through your body. And that vibration is, you go into a room where someone's doing that, you get goose flesh. You know immediately where somebody is speaking from in their body.
So this unfolding exploration of creativity is something that's going on for you at your leading edge, but it must also be something that's characterized an interest of yours for your life. And I'm curious if you have memories of being a child and encountering something that struck you as art or struck you as creative, for the first time. What do you remember encountering going, oh, that's a thing. I'm interested in that.
Yes, as a little kid, my dad was an architect. He would take me onto building sites and a hard hat and little boots, and I'd be walking around the dirt, and I feel very at home in that space, because what is happening is there's a dismantling and there's a construction and a deconstruction going on. And so as a metaphor, I would listen to these conversations between the architect and the engineer. The engineer would say, really, you're not as important as me because I'm doing the math. This building would not go up without me. And I would hear the architect say, you might do the math, but you're pathetic with aesthetic, and this building wouldn't have form. You would do the function, I'm doing the form. So from a little girl, I was like, wow, this building wouldn't exist without both of you. Like, can't you see the beauty here? It's the building that's important. So without having the words, before I could define and articulate this Taoism or this polarity or the brain hemisphere, the patterns where it shows up at every level, I was listening to adult conversations where they were trying to prove how important they were. And yet in my little eyes, I could say, you're both important. And you're both doing something you don't understand. There's the math and the art. And when these two come together, it's dynamite. Yeah, so I was very lucky that I had a mom and a dad who were both very creative. My mom was a classical ballet dancer, so I became aware of gesture and embodiment, and my dad was visual and textual, a student of the sacred. But I was abandoned most of the time because my parents were very creative and doing their thing. So what was also painful was this void that I had to fill myself. I became self-directed very early, and I fell into my imagination because I was left alone a lot of the time. It wasn't an easy childhood, but it had rich gifts. There was always classical music loud as I fell asleep, or poetry books, so I was stimulated, but I was left to my own devices. And in retrospect, that was my deepest gift, was that I was bored and lonely. And until I faced those things, I couldn't generate what became my life passion.
There was a famous sketch comedy show in the 90s called Mr. Show. It's a bit like Monty Python. The sketches flowed into each other. It's very imaginative, very smart. And one sketch that I always remembered was a television ad for a play school where they would traumatize your children appropriately to the destiny you wanted for them. So they would be out there on the playground. Oh, this one, they want this one to be a lawyer. They need this kind of trauma. But so it's interesting to think about that kind of spacious absence and aloneness as being one of the forms of the right kind of neglect to help
I
cultivate.
encountered the void.
Yeah.
So there's many ways to encounter the void, but to me, that is the way you spark the creativity. So we can transform in 3 ways. It will happen despite you hormonally as we go through childhood, adolescence to midlife and old age. That's the hormonal unfolding, nothing you can do about that. The stages will happen if you let them, in other words. The second way is through pain and wounding, and what we would call levels of discomfort and ambiguity, change of context. Then there's the third way, which is having a nurturing educational system that has what we would call a transformational curriculum that is specially designed for experiences of pleasure and pain and learning and all sorts of wonderful things. So we fall into those. We will unfold anyway to a certain extent, but the other 2 things can help us speed that up until we start literally participating in our own unfolding consciously, which is a habit I fell into.
I get asked a lot to participate in discussions around, developing wisdom curriculums and things like that. And one of the things that I bring into those discussions a lot, that I connect with the making of art and the undertaking of creative projects, is something that I call for myself whim fulfillment. This sense of building the will, in a way, building a capacity of intention that begins from an internal prompt that you don't have to follow, that there's no survival or social pressure that forces you to follow that it's a completely optional thing to undertake this project, but you then commit yourself to it as a practice. And that allows it to be maximally intentional because it's not driven by something else, right? You may have to go and find food because you're starving, but you don't have to paint the Mona Lisa. You don't have to make a sculpture. So it becomes something whose prompt is purely out of you. And in order to fulfill that, to bring it into manifestation, it requires a sustained, somewhat arbitrary action of you just saying, I decided I'm going to do this. I'm the cause of this phenomenon, and I'm going to treat that as a discipline that I have to undergo. And it's a very beautiful process because it makes, first of all, it makes you more satisfied as a being, but it builds up your capacity to feel like you have the ability to creatively transform the world, that you have the strength to find it and the strength to hold it and the strength to cause yourself to fall into the form of the realization of your own impulse. It's one of the things that excites me the most about being alive.
Me too. Yeah, so there's lots we could show and highlight there. That is, how do we enter flow? So experts have mentioned that the challenge has to meet the skill. So the challenge of the moment and the skill need to meet each other. So the 10,000 hours, the discipline, the hard work, the working at the skill, and then the moment that is met and that challenge, they meet perfectly. If the skill level is less than the challenge, we're stressed. If the skill level is more than the moment, we're bored. So to keep updating our skill level, to keep meeting the moment, and it's hard work, it's emergence. That is what emergence is keeping our own personal flow in unison with the flow of the moment. And that takes agility, it takes curiosity, it takes discipline, the yin and the yang, it takes imagining and then manifesting, because the imaginal goes nowhere without the yang of the execution. So the imaginal feminine has to come out of the body through the yang, the masculine execution. So failed artists generally have a ton of imagination, but they've never got the execution part together. Or we have these beautiful engineers who can execute everything but don't have the imaginal. So we need both, and that's the Tao of creativity, is yang up, girls. and yin down, boys, because that's where the dynamite happens.
I'm thinking of, for lack of a better word, magic. I'm thinking of the way that certain forms of discourses and practices that we might call the occult or witchcraft or things like that have often been the, let's say, feminine supplement to a masculine religious social system. And they've often held space for certain kinds of practices of transformation and arousal and energization that people turn to in order to regain more contact with their creative forces. But there's also, in all of that, there's experiences that seem to involve creativity, but they also seem to have a non-linear impact on the world around you, right? So on the one hand, yes, you feel you go into this mode of sacred participation where things have a magical quality. But at the same time, certain kinds of gestures and encounters and ritual creative performances and creative states of mind seem to be able to affect the way the world flows outside of your immediate direct sphere of influence. I'm curious how you feel about that and how you feel about the connection between creativity and what we might call magic in general.
So, as I've said, different cultures have explained creativity in different ways. One of them is kundalini in India. The awakening is the coming aliveness. Creative people are generally very passionate, very alive, intense. They can overwhelm you. There's a ton of energy going on. So there is this belief that the sexual and the creative are the same flow. And I think that's probably true. There's a creative expression at the biological level, which is procreation. And then as we mature, that becomes co-creation at a different depth of creativity. So men are giving birth to new projects. It is the feminine, the birthing process. Even as an engineer who would absolutely hate that metaphor, there's a way that the sexuality of this experience is unavoidable. It's what we would call the Greeks called it Eros gamos, the marriage of the feminine and the masculine within the body. So at first we do it externally with the other partner. There's that creative tension, and that leads to a baby. As we mature, that becomes an internal process, and we begin to give birth to babies in different ways, but we still need the masculine and the feminine. So it's moved, whether you want to call it geographically upwards in the chakras, or whether you call it, as McGilchrist does, through the corpus callosum integration. What we're doing is Eros gamos. The Greeks knew about this, and they ritualized it with priestesses and kings doing mating rituals, calling down the gods to please enter the body and create fertility. At that point, fertility was valued. Now we're looking at mimetic fertility. How do we create mimetically as we enter more of an understanding of the noosphere, and how that in itself is a kind of a spreading, well, Dawkins said, we've moved from genes to memes.
I like this notion of mimetic fertility. I'm thinking of, and you connected it with the heart, I think, right? The healing function of creativity and the role that feeling seen and heard plays for a lot of people in healing, and the way that creativity affords us an additional set of options for being seen and heard. How significant is that need for people in terms of just coming to peace inside themselves, healing themselves, putting themselves in a supported position they need in order to go forward into other creative endeavors?
I think it's everything, because what you're describing is this yearning we have for intimacy. So if we can make the internal visible, and we do that in any of the symbolic languages, whether it's textual, visual, gestural, vocal, choral, rhythmic, These are metaphorical ways of expressing our interiors and making them visible. When we do that, we bridge the separation, the aloneness we feel, the existential separation is bridged. So there's always a triangle between artist, object, and community or audience. And when that triangle is completed, it's ecstatic. So we've met, we are met by the other, and we've overcome our separation for a moment. And that's what keeps us creating and creating, is that deep desire to communicate our most private interior spaces, and to be met and loved and seen and understood. That's why we keep generating more and more. Could I also then add that there's blockages to creativity, one of which is the self-doubt, the fear of being seen and heard. So we're just flipping this now, that it's the fear, it's always both at the same time. I'm afraid to be seen and heard, but that's my deepest yearning. So how do I face that fear and act anyway? It takes huge courage to be seen and heard.
It seems like the balance of, say, self-doubt and self-confidence might look different in those different modes of creativity you associated with the chakras. For example, if a person was working primarily on healing, then they might need to sort of really struggle with that self-doubt and try to move toward, take that risk of being seen and heard. But on the other hand, if you were doing some kind of work that you thought really had some specific cultural value, then you might want to really use that self-doubt as a means of constantly challenging and tweaking what you're doing, because you're not just doing it for your own therapeutic transformation. You're doing it to have some transformation on the world that might feel a little bit different.
Yeah, so we make cultural objects. And that cultural object is literally operating at all those levels, generally speaking. It's not only healing, it's impacting. So to separate, I'm an expressive arts therapist, so I'm trying to help people heal through bringing an object into existence. So you can't generally separate them, but this is the dynamic, is if you're working at the therapeutic level, I have a story to tell, and I will heal when it's told and somebody's witnessed it. So I need to be able to tell the story. Now, I can tell that story visually or verbally or gesturally if I'm pre-verbal about it. Most people don't have the words for a really bad wound. They come later, they're working pre-verbally. So there's different languages for expressing the story. Then there's also ways that we tell the story. We can tell the story of the past, which is our trauma, our pain, our wound. That happened in the past. We can learn to drop our story in the present, which is to become aware and meditative and empty. Then we can start imagining a new story, which is what all the evolutionary people are talking about. How do we imagine a new story? Because we've got to imagine it before we bring it into reality. But that happens on the personal level too. But there's no other moment but the present moment. So we're learning to do those things in the present moment. We're learning to tell the past. We're then learning to drop it. And then we're learning to visualize the new story. That's the healing trajectory at the healing level of the story, which can also just be a cultural object that we then put into culture and we sell it and we make money. And so we're operating at the level of survival as well.
I have a fairly constant flow of curiosities. So I'm perfectly happy to keep prompting and questioning, but I also wanted to say, if you want to question me or you want to take this conversation in any particular directions, I'm perfectly happy with that as well. Otherwise, I'll just keep doing what I've been doing.
No, I would love to hear from you, Layman, as somebody I see as deeply beginning to explore this, what is the creative thing? And you keep coming up with new product and new emergent thinking and divergent thinking. And I also see you as in your bodily form, presenting as masculine. And generally speaking, those two things are hard to bring together because the feminine gets shamed out of the masculine. So creativity needs to be facing the shame, coming forth, sallying forth, being seen and heard, and courageously owning that aspect, reintegrating the feminine in a very masculine body, which you present as the deep voice, the square jaw. There's a stereotype that people will perceive you as. And what I'm seeing is you're breaking out of that. And I'd love to hear more about that. You're wearing hats, you're wearing sunglasses, you're using humor, you're experimenting, you're being open, you're taking risks. That's what we need for creativity.
I have a fancy feminine shirt. My household was, I think, very open, right? There, you were just allowed to find your way. Nothing was really put off limits. And my parents were both very creative and artistic to the point where I wouldn't have understood that art was a thing, right? I just assumed it was something everybody did sometimes.
Wow.
So for me, it wasn't something where I had to cross a distance to come into that space. I presume that the sense of love and the sense of touch and the sense of appreciation of beauty in my environment led me fairly early on to feel comfortable with decorative play of various kinds, whether it's costuming or making art or things like that. But on the other hand, my brother is not so much like that. So some of it was either very circumstantial or inbuilt tendencies. I did adapt to costume play, let's say very early on, not in any professional sense, but I just always like to put lots of different clothes, put on all the clothes, just like with speech. I want to use all the words I know. I'm going to wear all the clothes I have. In fact, I'll go and change several times during the same interaction when I was a kid. And that was fun. And I think it was facilitated by a certain distance I felt from those things. That very early on, I was suspicious of what I saw as the social surface. And clothing and language and forms were like that as well. I felt a distance between them and myself. So I could go into them, put them on, take them off because they weren't the same as me. I was a little bit indifferent to clothing, which meant I could wear any hat I wanted. There wasn't a hat that defined me. I was outside of that feeling. And also, I sort of fell in love with some very avant-garde thinkers early on in my life. I was a big fan of surrealists and philosophers and experimentalists who, many of them put the narrow rational mode of thought and also fixed gender roles into question. So it seemed to me that that's was a normal thing to do. Like looking historically at people I found fascinating, many of them didn't care about those boundaries. So that seemed to me a normal human thing to do. And then also I would say a certain greediness. I remember, I've told this story before on this channel, which was in some of my earlier experiences of pornography and things that were of a sexually arousing nature when I got to that age. It kind of irritated me that there were things other people were getting turned on by, right? That there was a section at the back of the magazine, so to speak, with all these different forms of stimuli. And I thought, boy, I'm really straightforward in what's exciting me. What are those people getting turned on? They shouldn't be getting turned on by something I'm not getting turned on by, right? So you're built the way you're built. Those things didn't actually turn me on very much, but I wanted to go into them and check them out. I wanted to explore because the idea that there was some kind of excitement, some kind of pleasure, some kind of activation that was available. I thought, well, if it's available, I should be getting it. So I ended up being very exploratory in a lot of areas. And there's a lot of risk taking too. Like high school was a lot of, am I really going to do this? Right? Am I really going to wear this? Am I really going to? So I'm constantly challenging myself because I felt disgruntled about I could feel myself tailoring my behavior to what seemed to be the norms of the institution and my peers, and that felt unacceptably oppressive. And I would do things that felt scary to me in order to break that, in order to show up in public in a way that felt freeing to me. So that's a bunch of it.
So just to reflect back, what I heard is you fell early into realizing you were more than your gender. You had the courage to cross boundaries and play with that. Your identity was bigger than the stereotypes that people projected on you. You were probably very challenging as a student to your teachers because they probably couldn't contain your incredibly divergent thinking, that you were integrating a lot of stuff before they had. You were questioning authority. In other words, you showed up as a deeply creative human early on. There's probably some of it genetic because it happened early. But I also think there's a karmic thing, but that's another thing, that you probably had a lot of lifetimes where you've explored this. You were open to exploring gender, which is very threatening to most people, especially at Blue. And so finding the right partner can be hard for creatives because the men tend to explore their feminine and the women explore their agency, and that's threatening to traditional partnership. So I see you breaking lots of limits early, and look at you, you're still doing it. And hopefully it's a lifelong journey. That's the thing about creativity. It's forever. It's a way of being. It's who we are.
Yeah, I don't think I could be otherwise, certainly not at this point. And I'm also aware that I can play the polarities against each other a little bit, right? I sometimes make the joke that I can put a flower in my ear because I have a beard, right? Like they can anchor each other.
Yeah. So there's this thing about the Eros of creativity. And you actually, like I see it in humans who are very creative, there's an androgyny. So this is speaking into the taboo, and I'm doing it regularly now, is playing with androgyny is a deeper identity. It falls below gender. We know we're not our gender. That's just a bodied filter. It's a hormonal display that's temporary. So when we fall into this fractal identity, oh my God, I am this possibility of emergence. That's my identity. Now I'm free to play with all my parts. That is very threatening to culture. And that's why teachers find creatives hard. Partners find them hard. Yeah.
That's also why it was, I think, gated in the early tribal circumstance, right? There's a lot of creativity and androgyny in what I might call the shamanic caste of the tribes. And they were very often, right, there was a wall of taboo around that. You had to be let into those spaces. And partly because they were trying to protect themselves from the way in which they unsettled other people sometimes. And I think I've been lucky that my particular form and skill set has enabled me to bypass a lot of the negative effects of disturbing people, right? The fact that, I mean, if I happen to be a straight, white, bearded male body who can speak authoritatively in linear sentences, and I can socially facilitate my relationship with teachers very well, behave and get good marks throughout the school system, that buys me a lot of wiggle room to do things that might otherwise have seemed too disturbing. But because of these certain features that I had, the disturbing quality to others was tolerated. I always thought someone was going to stop me, and they didn't. They just kept letting it happen, which caught me off guard and left me feeling I was suddenly out. After a while, you're out in a territory where it feels uncharted. You know, like, how did they let me come this far outside of the village? There's no way I could go back now.
So you generated a trust early on their part. That's wonderful. You pulled that off. Because a lot of creatives go through a phase of rebellion when they can't acknowledge that there is an external authority and I have my own authority. So I'm speaking from that. But until we can do both, oh yes, in this field, you are the authority. In this one, I am. and being able to bring the interior and exterior together. There is this conflict initially for young creatives, and they cause a lot of trouble. They're very misunderstood.
Oh, I saw a lot of that, and maybe you can relate to this. But maybe it moves you a little bit toward the teaching and counseling roles, things like that, which is, I felt something like an ethical responsibility for creative people who couldn't manage it to whatever minimal degree I was managing it, right? That I would see people do very strange things, and I thought, of course, that seems natural. It seems desirable. I want them to keep doing it, but they can't sit down with the principal and have a discussion about what's going on here in a way that makes sense to the authority figure. And so
you have a gift of articulation as well.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of creatives don't have that, so they can't. Their creativity shows up in other languages. But you have those.
Of being inarticulate and of having a kind of oppositional defiance to authority, trying to buy themselves the space they needed to experiment. A lot of them didn't have a circumstance where they could be tolerated by the people around them, and I felt like I could, and I felt like I had to stand for them in some of the institutional settings.
So this is interesting in that creativity isn't just within the individual, it's the 4 quadrants. It's often pathologized by institutions. Oh, this person doesn't want to think like the rest of us. Let's punish them. Let's make them sit in the corner. Let's repress them. So the mental health of creatives is another whole huge topic. It suffers because they can't express themselves. They're not allowed to. So until they get the courage to liberate that, their mental health is often at risk. And yet finding the agency to articulate the thing, whatever that is, leads to the ultimate mental health. That's what we're here for, to find that purpose, that articulation, that voice that is unique. It takes a lot of guts. It also takes a village. It takes self-belief. It takes risk of being alone. That's the ultimate fear for the creative. If I show up, show myself, I will be rejected from the tribe. I will be alone. I will die. That's the subconscious thinking. So until we can face that fear of aloneness and ostracization, as a creative, we might not express the thing. We always have a cost to our creativity.
And I want to say luck as well, right? There's so many moments wherever it's succeeded that it might have completely failed and collapsed.
And flourished, like in the Renaissance. Like people have looked at, why was the Renaissance so creative? Was it just a flowering of imagination? Well, actually, it was the church acting as a patron. They've now decided that because there was support in the community for genius, it blossomed. So we could imagine what a basic level of income would do to liberate human creativity. We need to understand it's social as well as individual.
Yeah, the support conditions are essential, right? Whatever minimal amount of resourcing is needed, socially, financially, structurally, but also interpersonally. Like one of the things I got in the home was a relaxed body that was nourished by a strong sense of support, to the point where I could take risks of aloneness that might be too much for other people, because I felt like I was still fundamentally embraced by some tribe.
They had your back.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even if they didn't or didn't know about it or didn't understand, built into my body was the feeling that they did.
Yeah, and that sense of safety is at the core. The relaxed state, the theta brainwaves, the parasympathetic, we've noticed, and leisure time. Those are the contexts for the best circumstances for creativity to flower. So in wartime, places of danger and starvation, there's very little creativity except how will we get across this river? So the flowering into cultural objects requires a certain amount of safety, leisure, support. It's systemic.
I was going to ask you something about the brain waves, because When I was a kid, the focus was sort of just on beta, alpha, theta, delta. And I paid a lot of attention to theta. We even had theta wave induction audio cassettes when I was a little kid that I would listen to after school. But now there's a lot of focus on the gamma waves that move even faster than beta and are involved in high-speed performance activities of various kinds. Sometimes it's found in meditators, but I wonder how you think about that in terms of creativity and about the kind of creativity that might come in very intense, very fast flow states, like the creativity of a martial arts battle or something like that, the creativity of an Olympian skiing down a hill, things like that, because that's quite different in terms of tempo from the theta wave creativity.
Yeah, I think there's an element of being on the edge with gamma. It's like, I am so alive and focused and present because if I'm not, I'm going to be dead. Like I'm speeding down this hill and I'm so in the zone, I can face any arising challenge because I'm a master of my body. Gamma, I've watched that video of Ken Wilber entering delta states while still awake. That is my level of attainment. I don't know about gamma. I don't think I go there. I'm not a physical risk taker, but people who, and there's probably adrenaline involved. There's probably a cocktail of chemicals with gamma. I'm not sure, actually. I've never seen, I've seen people with ECGs showing what brainwave they're in, doing different activities, and Ken was just lying there going into delta but wide awake. That in itself is a vast accomplishment, staying awake in delta. But gamma is a whole, I don't know, I can't answer that for you.
Another question I have, and this comes up for me partly because we're talking about things like support and trust and tribe, but also because I'm going to be leading a retreat themed around goodness at the end of next month, or I guess this month now. How do you think of goodness? What is goodness, Sally?
It's a tripod. And when I'm making good art or books, I try to make sure all three are built into it. Obviously, beauty is relegated as the lesser of the two by yang people. Yin might focus on beauty, making the cooking, the gardening, the home, the art. So, but I personally like to build in all three to my product. So the books I write, they have to be research-based and present what we understand to be true in that moment, but that evolves. So you always ascribe and you put a date stamp. 10 years, it'll be different. Right now, in this moment, this is true as far as we know. Is it good? Is it heart-opening? Is it going to help people heal and understand and connect at a deeper emotional level? Is it looking at the best of humanity, not just presenting the problems? And for me as an artist, beauty is always there. Is the thing that I say or make or paint aesthetic as well? And then I think if you could also add humor, extra points. But that's always an extra skill. I think that's the move to second tier. Some people say, I don't know if that's true. Humor's been around forever. Shakespeare talked about it. The Greeks talked about it. I don't think it's a new thing. People are claiming that as meta-modern. I don't know.
Again, I think of this Arthur Koestler book, The Act of Creation. A third of it's devoted to the structure of humor as creativity. But also I'm thinking of Nietzsche, who I started to read quite early. And he's an interesting character in terms of the discussion we were having, because he's very masculine, but has a lot of these creative feminine elements, right? He privileges beauty and aesthetics as justification. He's about humor, about the unconscious, about ecology, about the body, all this stuff in there. And yet he's a very isolated, mountaintop, mustachioed European individual. So I think that's one example of a historical character that I'd come across in my youth who combined a lot of these things. So it seemed to me there were a lot of a lot of templates, quite a lot of examples. If you're allowed to search through cultural and historical space, there's templates for almost every balance that you might find yourself capable of. And I think a lot of people are trapped in their local cultural pool. They sort of only know what's going on in their community or their nation or in the entertainment space that's currently popular. And they don't have a sense of what all the historical options are, what it was like in the Renaissance, or, you know, what people were doing in ancient tribes. I think with a richer sense of history, I think more people would find their way to a more diverse set of self-expression options.
Yeah, and I don't mean to say that a balanced human who's doing all three needs to be an artist. I know lots of men in particular who do all three just through their appreciation. So, for example, someone like David Attenborough, he's your man's man. He was an explorer, discoverer, always in the four-wheel drive Jeep, out exploring, facing wildlife, danger, risk-taking, exploration. But in his speech, he talks about the beauty of these things. Like, it's deeply in him. He's not a visual artist, but he can feel it. He is moved by it. He's allured by it. He celebrates it. So I don't mean to say people need to be artists to be into beauty. It's almost like a sensorial openness to perception and a touching of the soul. It's a soul quality. So you can have very masculine men who are not artists, but who are deeply moved by beauty. That's kind of the tripod is accomplished.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about perception as a creative act, right? And obviously we can encounter things that we're built to find beautiful, various forms of nature, for example, or the way that the genders can find each other alluring. But there's also a sense in which, in a kind of yogic move, right, that people can learn a capacity to find beauty, to find novelty, to find an extra level of salience and nourishment in almost any perception if they organize their feelings toward it properly. And I wonder what you think about learning the art of perceiving better.
Yeah, so that is one of the qualities of yin. So it's allowing the reception to come inwards from the external. It's the energetic movement of the external into the interior and being touched, listening, perceiving, openness. So the most masculine of humans can practice that. That's not becoming girly or an artist, or it's a receptivity when you allow the world to move into you instead of you always impacting the world and putting your stamp on it. That's the masculine. Yeah, so it is sensorial, it's openness, it's deep listening, it's emptiness instead of fullness in a way. It's like allowing yourself to be filled by the beauty. It's an energetic movement, internal, as opposed to impact, external. Yeah, and that is something we can develop. Some people have it innately, like practicing lying on your sofa listening to a symphony. It's a practice to opening to beauty. You don't have to be an artist. You can be a receiver. So it's a state, might I add. We cultivate states of openness, emptiness, a reception.
Yeah, what popped into my mind was a question like, and this is totally off the previous topic, or maybe it's not. If you could send a message back to yourself as a girl, you know, what one extra piece of information or advice from you now would have helped her in her development and unfolding to go a little faster, a little smoother, a little more gracefully, something like that?
It's a big question, and I think it's a common one. I would probably tell myself to drop the internalized statement, you are too much, because I am a lot. I'm a lot of things. What I've had to learn is to drop that pejorative self-view, which I got from society around me. which was their response to my explosive creativity. So it took me a while to break through that limiting self-perception. You're too much. If you want to be in relationship to family, community, partner, you need to shut the fuck up. And I think the deepest learning for me was, what if you don't do that? What if you don't shut the fuck up? What do you risk? And it's rejection, ostracization from the tribe, aloneness. So that's one of my deepest practices now, is I practice aloneness often in order to not be attached to outcomes, to speak the thing, to feel the evolution moving right through my body, out through my hands, my voice, my being. Trust that and know that I'm never alone. That was a misperception. You're never alone. So that's what I'm practicing now, is the submersion into the ecology of my environment and trusting that. So it's a reversion, as we said, to indigeneity and thinking ecologically. I'm just an expression of the whole. It's not so scary. I'm not risking anything because we're all going to die anyway.
It seems to me there's an interesting dance between shutting the fuck up and not shutting the fuck up, because sometimes we communicate a lot in ways that are actually blocking the space for the communication that we're inhibiting, right? So the skill of shutting the fuck up is sometimes really important for people, because they're very often communicating something that isn't their creativity at all.
Yeah.
And that in a way poisons the space against their creativity sometimes. But on the other hand, you have to constantly take that risk of bringing forward those things, certain things. So then discernment becomes a really big issue of like, what actually do I have to say? What actually is my creative expression choice, as opposed to just the outpouring from the surface level that everyone seems capable of.
Yeah, so discerning between noise and authentic voice is important. When you are, because right now there's a Tower of Babel happening, everybody is speaking. So not only as a consumer do we need to really listen to the wavelength of that person. To me, it's a frequency. I can feel it in my whole body. And I'm struck by the authenticity and originality. And then I will tune in closer to that voice, and I will cut out the noise, because we have to discern. But it's also an interior thing, is, do I need to say the thing? What is that impulse? It's a red one. Can I say it also from so it's learning to speak multilingually to your audience. I can speak blue, I can speak red, I can speak green. Right now I'm speaking second tier with this audience. I wouldn't speak like this with other audiences. I tailor my language. I never mention evolution or spirituality in other places. So getting a multilingual approach to respecting your audience so that you can reach them. So don't just say the thing. Say it carefully and mindfully and kindly, but don't not say it if you need to say it. So there's a level of unapologeticness, but it needs to be compassionate. And you need the wisdom to discern who you're speaking to, so the audience is front and center, because otherwise you won't even reach them. So why say it? So there's a respect for capacity. And that's only coming on for me now. I'm 61. I'm only really figuring that one out, how to be multilingual with the thing that I'm saying.
You mentioned death a minute ago, and death is one of those, it's one of those things in that yin grab bag that gets marginalized in a lot of discussions. And so it brought me back to that question of cultural insufficiency in the degree to which the yin is integrated. And I'm curious how you see that showing up in integral, meta-modern, liminal web, these sorts of new thought spaces where there's there's ostensibly a lot of invitation, there's a lot of space, a lot of affirmation of these qualities, recognition of the need for all these phenomena, but it's not always backed up in the actual manifestation. How do you see yin being present sufficiently or insufficiently in these communities, and what do you think we could do to make that balance more generative?
Yeah, this is a very important question, because one of the ways I see it is that a lot of the yang energy, or the masculine, which holds the authority, has actually bypassed green in many ways, and then turned around and people point that out and say, that's just mean green, you saying that. But you can tell in the way people hold space, how they deal with diversity and conflict, whether they've integrated green. I don't care how much academia they've mastered. If they're not holding space in a green way or beyond, you can tell immediately. So there is no bypassing green to get to second tier, and it's been demonized so badly. So within the green capacity, the tool we're learning is to bring multiple voices in. That is the tool, whether it's the feminine, whether it's the Black, whether it's the marginalized. Until we've mastered that skill, we can move in some ways to yellow and beyond, and we can conceptualize a lot beyond and pretend we're there. We can speak the thing, but to actually hold the space, that's the skill. And then to learn to integrate and respect the different voices and speak their language. And so many ways of being. The feminine is different from the masculine, the Black from the white, and not honoring their worldview is a violence. It's not compassionate. And the orange objectivity that lingers in our being can be very violent, and yellow can be extremely cold and critical. So we have to be aware that masculine objectivity needs to always be balanced with the subjectivity. And that's the work, is integrating objectivity and subjectivity. That is integral.
So you think we could be, as a community, better at the embodied holding space for the postmodern intelligence in its healthy forms?
Yeah,
and it's invite in a lot of the otherwise marginalized yin qualities.
Yeah, it shows up in all bodies when emotions are shut down. And when emotions come, the people who are triggered by others' emotions means they haven't embodied themselves. So you can always tolerate others up to the level you've attained. So if there's a lot of emotions and you get triggered and want to just shut that down, start your own group, you know that you haven't done that work yourself. That's your shadow. So it shows up. And if you can tolerate diversity and difference, you might be a turquoise, but you did your green work. And that shows. We can't bypass all the capacities. Each stage is another level of capacity. And we don't leave it behind. It comes with us. So you can conceptually project a higher level, but if you haven't done the work, it shows in how you deal with people.
Yeah, I tend to think we've done a disservice to green in this kind of discussion community over the last few decades. There's a sense in which, and partly it's obvious, if you're going to try to propose something that's on the far side of green, and you want to clarify that distinction from green and go, green didn't solve these problems, we've got to solve these problems. It's very natural to focus on second tier and the yellow and the teal. But there's a sense in which, first of all the people coming into that must be coming into that through green, in a sense, and that bridge has to be healthy and stable and wide so that more people can come into it. But also, we haven't really seen it. It's so new, right? We've seen thousands of years of medieval mythic membership role-playing symbolic culture, and we've seen centuries of modernity being in charge. And a few decades of postmodern, pluralistic, ecological emergence in the culture is barely enough time for it to have started. I think we've been really hasty in thinking we've seen it, we know what it is, it failed, and we're moving on. They go, no, it's barely started, right? Even if we have something that's legitimately on the other side, so to speak, it's going to continue to grow and change in the centuries to come. We need to be really attentive to the fact that there's more in green than any of us have yet seen. And we have to constantly experientially update ourselves to the still emerging richness that it has to offer.
Yeah, I'm going to say something controversial. And I know that the immediate reaction will be not all men. So I'm anticipating that. But what I'm going to say is not out of laziness, not out of meanness, not out of ill-intended anything. There's a shadow that comes with privilege, that you didn't have to do any of this work to some extent because you didn't have the same levels of trauma and pain. We said there are 3 ways people transform: through education, through pain, and hormonally. So you might have had the best education. You might have had the normal body hormonal development. Where was the suffering? Can you look at the suffering of others, even if you haven't had that? Because that's the shadow of the privilege. And I'm not condemning any gender, any level of education, anybody, but if we're to handle multiple voices, if we splinter off pain and suffering, we're not really including that other human that's bringing with them a load of trauma. You can't hope trauma away. Trauma is in everybody. It's escalating and it's being exorcised and vocalized. When somebody shows up in pain, the worst thing you can do is dismiss them. Yeah, so the white masculine private school elitist beautiful being that can sprout forth, no condemnation there. Their experience has not included a lot of suffering, and so there's a lack of compassion. And not all men is true. Yeah.
And it's, I would just like to expand that, because it's the suffering of the other person that we need to become more sensitized to. Yeah. But it's also the presence of suffering in ourselves that we're not necessarily sensitized to, because there's a lot of people who appear not to have had suffering, and they collude in that appearance by not having experienced the suffering they did have, even though it looked different than someone else's suffering. So for them to find their own suffering and to find the suffering of other people, and then also to find the suffering of the non-human beings that's going on all around. So like a general expansion of that capacity to not just to be, to volunteer to be, to want to be empathically wounded, right? To desire it, to see it as a positive quality, to lean into those difficult experiences.
So when you talk about the yin, it's inviting the death, the pain, trauma into the space and not shutting it down, because the wounding of the patriarchy for men has been an agony too, that you cannot touch into that. It's become a way of being. To be masculine means you must just stiff upper lip, endure, not feel the pain, push through, which has helped us survive as a species. But now we can let that go. And so that has to show up in metamodernism. Psychologically, it's a psychic shift, huge. That's why a lot of men are bypassing green, because that's the invitation of green, is to be more inclusive, not only of others, but your own experiences that you've repressed.
Yeah, I would tend to define green structurally anyway as the attempt to enfold the externalities of the system in all kinds of ways, right? It's our own shadow. It's the other groups we've left out. It's also the things we're not pricing into the economy and the pollution side effects of our production systems. It's the ecological environment that we left out of the human evaluations. We set up these wonderful, really powerful modern systems that are loaded with intelligence and capacity, but we've been running them as if they constituted the whole picture, and they keep producing seemingly counterintuitive negative effects while they're running. And there's this whole additional realm, all these other dimensions at each part of the modern process that need to be folded into the modern system in order for it to run in a way that's healthy, in order for it to stop producing as many negative effects as it produces positive effects. Right. And at the level of the individual, a large part of that is opening our consciousness, yes, but our feeling and our sensitivity to body, death, the suffering of others, all these sorts of things.
It's almost like at red, the impulse was, I want to be seen and heard. And at green, it's almost like everybody wants to be seen and heard. How do we do that?
Yeah.
There's a lot of noise, there's a lot of anxiety, there's a lot of tears. And there's also deconstruction of power. So the postmodern thing is looking at who has the voice, who maintains the space with just their voice, who's got the power. How did that happen? And how can we empower now, as opposed to distribute it ourselves? Like, we'll give you some power, but not you. You can vote, but you can't. You can say something, but you don't have a platform. Now it's how do we help everybody empower from the interior, as well as how do we include your voice?
And individually, like, there's an interplay. If we're going to use the masculine feminine metaphor, there's a masculine capacity that's needed in terms of safeguarding our resources for being available, right? We don't have an endless amount of time and heart to hear everybody's expression and suffering all the time. We need to gate that at certain moments, right? And that can be difficult because one of the problems is people not being open to that stuff at all. Another problem is people being constantly too open to it to the point that it sabotages themselves and they're not open in the future for more rich engagements.
Yeah, so self-editing is important.
Yeah.
And discriminating, where do I do my healing? Is it in this group or that?
Yeah.
Probably take it to a therapeutic group, do lots of healing. And then when you come into this space, which of my voices do I use there appropriately? So that's a big skill to learn, is how to self-edit and how to fall into silence when needed.
One of the real gifts of green, I think, has been the conversation around things like boundaries and things like agreements, which don't always have to be verbal, but there's a sense in which some people will exploit communication to try to do their therapeutic work, right? When the people they're communicating with have not agreed to that as the form of communication, things like that. So I think that's, this new approach to the dynamics of communication is one of the most beautiful things that green brings forward, is thinking about how do we communicate to get consent? How do we communicate agreements? How do we think about where we allow and where we don't allow, given that that's an always shifting, mutually constructed variable?
Yeah, and the moderator's job of a group like that is really hard. And I respect people trying to do that. It's not easy.
Well, we've gone longer than the hour and a half that we proposed. Should we go a few more minutes? Is there anything else you want to talk about? Or are we all done?
I think I've covered stages, states, the 4 quadrants, the perennial anatomy, Taoist view of creativity, Indian view of creativity, Maslow's view, Wilber's view of states and intelligence, lines of intelligence, left brain, right brain with McGilchrist. There's so much information out there. I don't expect other people to have passionately spent decades doing what I did. Yeah, only to end up understanding that, to me, creativity is your identity. And when you start speaking from your deepest place, your identity shifts. There's a lot of people who've explored voicing things that come from beyond them. They're Seth, Abraham. There's a lot of people out there who start entering this weird world of prophecy. And in some ways, all that is speaking from slightly in the future. People can access something in the future that they begin to speak about before it's time. We call that prophecy. And I think I think that's coming online. I think people who've done their practice, who've done their work, who've clarified the noise and the silence and who let that oscillate, always speak from the silence. The non-doing and the doing begin to integrate. There's no split between object and subject. You start speaking from a much deeper, more profound, authentic place. The ego is stepped out of the way. The voice is clarifying. It's not about you anymore or your platform. It's not about you making noise and garnering the supply of attention. It's about saying something that you literally can no longer stop, and it makes you very unpopular, and you need to be ready for that. And stand alone. Break through that aloneness and realize you're never alone. That you're both a unique individual learning the skills as well as an identity that is vast, eternal, powerful, and wants to use your body. That your body is an instrument of evolution. To surrender to that is really hard, but it becomes your motivation, it becomes your purpose, and it becomes the thing that gives you, is an embodied feedback. The ecstasy is so profound that you can't stop. Anything good feels good. When you eat, you stay alive. When you make love, it's ecstatic. You procreate and the species continues. This kind of evolutionary, unique self becomes ecstatic. But then you have to watch out for narcissism and grandiosity and keep clarifying the creativity. And there's always an ethical lag with something that is new and emergent. That comes later. Make an H-bomb, well, it takes a couple of decades to develop the ethics around that creation. So beware. It's the razor's edge that you're walking.